Hyper Light Drifter is an independent video game released by Heart Machine in 2016. It was crowdfunded through an immensely successful Kickstarter campaign in 2013. The game is the brainchild of Alex Preston, an illustrator and designer who has suffered from a potentially life-threatening heart condition since birth. Alex has stated that the game has autobiographical elements to it and that illness is one of its central themes. The protagonist, the Drifter, suffers from violent and debilitating coughing fits throughout, and imagery of mechanically augmented flesh abounds. Hyper Light Drifter is a 2D action role-playing game which cites games such as The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past and Diablo as its main influences. The game uses a visual style reminiscent of the 8-bit and 16-bit graphics of early games consoles and employs an audio aesthetic which backs this up through its score and sound design. The game's music was composed by Richard Vreeland. The sound design was created by Akash Thakar. In this essay, I am going to consider how audio elements in Hyper Light Drifter engage with and provoke feelings of nostalgia in the player. However, it is important to keep in mind that it is the combination of audio and visual elements, fixed media sections, gameplay mechanics, and player interactions which make the game what it is. As Karen Cook notes when talking of nostalgia in games, musical signifiers alone could not create a nostalgic product. In order to engage with the concept of nostalgia, first we require a definition from which to refine our purpose. For this definition, I turn to concepts of nostalgia proposed by Svetlana Boym in her book The Future of Nostalgia. In this book, Boym outlines two categories of nostalgia, restorative and reflective. She also makes it clear that these are not absolute types, but tendencies. Boym states that restorative nostalgia manifests itself in total reconstructions of monuments of the past, that it proposes to rebuild the lost home. In contrast to this, Boym describes reflective nostalgia as the imperfect process of remembrance, stating that reflective nostalgia cherishes shattered fragments of memory. Using these concepts, I am going to explore Hyper Light Drifter as a piece of reflective nostalgia and examine the strategies through which this reflection is achieved. First though, as a brief counterpoint, I will consider another game through this framework, as an example of a game which, through its development, both approaches and deviates from a restorative strategy. Much has changed in the 3 decades since the initial release of the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, an 8-bit home video game console first released in 1983. Technological advancements in video game hardware mean that audio and visual elements in modern games can have much more complex representations at any one time, and the size and scope of games has increased remarkably. Whilst the technical capacity of game development has grown, so too have the budgets. This has resulted in a trend towards hyper-realism in mainstream video games, along with the simultaneous rise of a smaller, homemade indie game scene, partially due to the success of crowdfunding platforms such as Kickstarter, and this has resulted in a wave of games more niche in presentation and scope. Shovel Knight is a 2D side-scrolling platforming game released by Yacht Club Games in 2014. Its lead programmer, David D'Angelo, explains the philosophy behind Shovel Knight very simply in a blog post for Gamasutra. What if development for the NES never stopped? How would an 8-bit game feel and play if developed today? The question D'Angelo poses initially sounds like a nostalgically restorative process, attempting directly to simulate the hardware constraints of a 3-decade-old console, using modern game design philosophy to bring it to a new generation. However, it becomes evident from commentary on the design process that the development of this game would not be entirely faithful to the technical constraints of the NES. D'Angelo says, "We imagined perhaps some cartridge advancements would allow for the techniques displayed in Shovel Knight. We also broke some NES limitations purely out of preference. From this we gather that what began as an act of veneration for an antiquated system is almost immediately subverted by the opportunities afforded by modern innovation." D'Angelo goes on to demonstrate this subversion when talking specifically about the audio in the game, saying, "Another limitation of the NES was that sound effects would often cause one of the audio channels to drop out. The NES shared the same 5 basic channels for both music and sound, so the SFX would temporarily steal one or more of these music channels in order to be played. This effect is not present in Shovel Knight. The sound effects are simply layered on top of the music, which is completely inauthentic, but much nicer to listen to." Here we see that while restorative nostalgia informs the act of creation, it does not drive it. Ostensibly, Yacht Club Games wanted to create a game which appeared to have come from a parallel universe where NES development never ceased. However, what they ultimately ended up doing was taking well-loved and remembered elements of NES-era games and vastly expanding their scope with the inclusion of modern technology, therefore reflecting, not restoring, and concurring with Boym when she states, "Reflection suggests new flexibility, not the re-establishment of stasis." In order to explore some of the techniques Hyperlight Drifter's audio developers used to establish a nostalgic rhetoric for the game, I will begin with a practical demonstration. The process of bit crushing involves lowering the dynamic range of a digital sound sample and reducing the amount of individual samples used per second to render the sound. Here, my voice is being reproduced with a dynamic range of 24 bits at a rate of 96,000 samples per second.
Here it is lowered to 6 bits and 12,000 samples per second. Now it is lowered to 3 bits and 6,000 samples per second. The process results in audible distortion and my voice is no longer accurately being reproduced.
This process can be used to emulate the sound reproduction capabilities of older games consoles, or it can be taken to further extremes for more aesthetic purposes. This technique was widely used by both the sound designer and composer of Hyperlight Drifter, who both concurred that bit crushing was key to achieving the aesthetic they desired. Vreeland puts it, "The secret sauce, bit crushers on everything." The prevalence of bit crushers in the audio production of Hyperlight Drifter helped to establish a nostalgic rhetoric and aesthetic, signifying technological limitations and sound reproduction capabilities of older consoles, but unlike the developers of Shovel Knight, not directly attempting to recreate them. In preparation for this essay, I interviewed Akash Thakar, the game's sound designer, over Skype, getting his take on the creative processes he employed during the game's development. He stated that initially he set out to make sounds which sounded like older games consoles such as the Super Nintendo Entertainment System and the Sega Genesis, sold outside the US as the Mega Drive. However, it quickly became apparent that this approach would not work. As he put it, frankly, it didn't sound good. There's an interesting thing with nostalgia where you remember the thing being like this amazing graphical or audio masterpiece, and when you go back to it when you're older, you're like, oh, is this actually what it looked like? Here, Thakar almost directly refers to the imperfect process of remembrance Boym identifies with reflective nostalgia. He then stated, "So I basically had to go at it from a point of view of making it sound like how people remembered hearing the Super Nintendo or Genesis, not how it actually sounded." In order to do this, Thakar used a mix of recorded and synthesized sounds, at a ratio of roughly 60-40, he estimated, although noting that each individual sound for the game was layered of sometimes dozens of individual sounds, both synthesized and recorded, such as the sword sound demonstrated here. In terms of processing, Thakar stated that he used a whole bunch of plugins like bit crushers and distortion. Interestingly, he implies that these were used as and when they were needed, and then explained that it was in fact the recording equipment he used which helped achieve the desired aesthetic over the effects themselves. Thakar used a 1950s wire recorder for a lot of the recorded sounds in the game, saying, "It's kind of like the thing which gave me that sound, because it distorts things in a really unique way, but not in such a way that is the same that you'd hear on a SNES cartridge or a Genesis. It's a different level of fidelity." We can see then that technology from 6 decades ago was used to create this false recollection of technology from 3 decades ago, while striving at the same time to create something new and original. Thakar goes on to identify the importance of making the game unique over making it referential, stating, "So instead of thinking, okay, I have this synth, let's make it sound like a Super Nintendo, I used stuff that made it sound like Hyperlight Drifter." Thakar mentioned that Vreeland, the composer, initially took a similar approach, trying to record his music through a tape machine, stating, "Similar sort of idea, like let's buy old tech and use it in this, and it didn't work. It sounded like garbage, it was just bad. So what he did instead was he went at it from a point of view like, I'm going to write a whole bunch of piano sketches and see how that sounds. And then kind of warped it and worked it through all these synths and his own style that he has already established." We also spoke about influences which informed the game. While confirming that the game was chiefly influenced by The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past and Diablo, he also stated that it drew on newer references such as From Software's game Dark Souls. In terms of specific Sonic references, Thakar said one of the templates for sound he used in this game was the sound in Metal Gear Solid, a game by Hideo Kojima released by Konami on the PlayStation 1, saying it inspired his ethos: go for stylization. Stylize it but make it make sense. There are parallels which can be drawn directly between the sounds of Metal Gear Solid and of Hyper Light Drifter. Hyper Light Drifter is a game which has tendencies towards reflective nostalgia. It is informed by cultural memory, referencing games and other media, but while it is informed by these things, it is not defined by them. Instead, it uses these reflections to enhance the very personal story of its creator's struggle and pain, and through the medium of games allows the player to experience for themselves this neon nightmare, as Preston described it. By contrast, a piece informed by restorative nostalgia would not have nearly as much room in which to grow and advance its own agenda. Focusing purely on restoration can risk diminishing the opportunities afforded by both the creative process and new technological developments. This is why, when we look at the example of Shovel Knight, the game manages to be successful by breaking its own defined limitations, by being a piece of reflective nostalgia in disguise. The development of Hyper Light Drifter was evidently not driven by a quest to make a game that was as referential as possible, but rather from a desire to make as individual and unique an experience as could be made. And through the combination of its every interlinking part, from sound design to score, from animation to gameplay mechanics, it creates an experience as striking and as thought-provoking as any game made before or since.